So what we're going to look at next is persisting our member edit changes up to the API. So what we're doing, if I just go back to the browser, we've only got a certain number of fields that we're allowing our user to edit. The introduction text, the looking for, the interests, and also the city and country. These are the only options that we're giving people to edit in this particular case. So we don't need to worry about other fields. So what we'll do is we'll create a new DTO and we'll create a new class and we'll call this user for update DTO. And in here we'll add the properties that we're allowing the user to edit. So I'll say prop string and the introduction. And because these are all string fields, I'm just going to copy this down a few times and update the individual fields in here. So I'll say looking for, interests, city, and country. And because we're going to want to map this to our actual user object, we'll need to go into our helpers folder to our automapper profiles. And we'll add a new mapping in here and say create map, and we'll say user for update DTO, as this is where we want to go from, and we want to map this into our user object. And then we need to go to our users controller and add a method to update the user. So let's open up the users controller, and just underneath our get user method we'll add a new method, and this time rather than an HTTP get, we'll use an HTTP put, which is typically used for updating a resource in an API, and that's what we'll use it for here. And we'll take in the ID of the user. So each method inside here needs either a unique path or it needs a unique verb. And because we're using a unique verb here, HTTP puts, with this ID, this method is going to match any HTTP puts with a path of ID after it. So in here we'll say a public async task of iAction result, and we'll call it update user, and it's going to take the int of ID, and then we'll pass in our user for update DTO and call it user for update DTO. Now the first thing we want to do is check that the user that's attempting to update their profile matches the token that the server's receiving. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to compare the ID of the path to the user's ID that's being passed in as part of their token. So what we can do, we can say if, and we'll say the ID, and this is the ID that's coming into our root in this case, and we'll say if this is not equal to int.pass, and then we'll say user.findFirst, and then we say claim types dot name identifier dot value, and then we'll return unauthorized if they don't match. And we also need to bring in system security claims in here as well. So we're going to use this method quite a lot, because this is how we're going to check to see if the user is the current user that's passed the token up to our server that's attempting to access this route and doing an HTTP put. And if this ID of the path the user's trying to access doesn't match what's in their token, then we're going to return unauthorized. The next thing we're going to do is get the user from the repo. So we're going to say user from repo equals await and repo.getUser, and we'll pass in the ID. Then what we need to do is take the information that's in our user for update DTO and map this into our user from repo. And to do that we can use mapper.map, and we have access to this. We've already been using it inside this particular controller. And in this case, we're just going to open up some parentheses, and we're going to say user for update DTO, and user from repo. And this is going to execute the mapping and effectively updates the values from user for update DTO and write them into our user from repo. And then what we can do is save our changes. So I'll say if awaits repo.saveAll. And if this is successful, then what we'll return from a update method is no content, is the appropriate response to send back from our API. And if we don't return no content, that means something's gone wrong. And we'll just throw a new exception. And we'll say, we'll add the dollar and some quotes, and we'll say updating user with ID failed on save. And we'll just need to bring in the exception from system. So this is our update method, and whenever we create a new method or a new action inside our API, the first thing we want to do is test that this method works in Postman. We don't want to immediately go to our SPA and try and see if this is working, because then if we do have a problem, then we have two places where the problem might be occurring. At least if we test in Postman and we encounter a problem, we know we only need to look at our API to try and solve this particular problem. If you skip ahead and you go straight to your Angular app and something's not working, then you've already made it more difficult for yourself, because now you don't know for sure whether it's the API that's got the issue or it's the Angular SPA. So let's go to Postman. And the first thing we're going to need to do is get a token to log in. So I'll just go to localhost 5000 API/auth/login. And this is a post request, and inside the body and raw and application JSON, I'll just specify username as Lola and the password as password. And I'll click on send, and this gives me my token back from the server. So then I can make use of this, and let me go to a new tab, and first of all I'll just make sure everything is working as it should do. So I'll go to the API and users, and in the headers I'll put in my authorization header, and the value I'll say bearer, and paste in the token and click send. And this gives me all of my users, so that's fine. Now the path that we want to use in this case, if I just go back to the API again, we're using an HTTP put request, and then we need to have the ID in the path of this request. So I'm logged in as Lola, and Lola has a user ID of 1. So what we'll need to do is I'll add a put request and users/1, and then in the body of this request, inside the raw and application JSON, I'm just going to paste in some text that we're going to use to update, and it's just the 5 fields that we're updating here: introduction, looking for, interests, city and country. And I've got my authorization header in, and if I now click on send, I get a 204 no content back, and that means this request was successful. And if I go back to the browser and I go back to matches and I just refresh this page and I go into Lola's profile, then I can see that my updated intro and updated looking for and all of this other information has updated inside here. So that works. So let's go back to Postman and do a couple of other tests. First of all, we want to see what happens if we try and send a put request to a user that should return an unauthorized, because if I'm logged in as Lola and that's the token I'm sending up to the server, then attempting to update somebody else's profile should meet with an error. And if I click on send, I get a 401 unauthorized. If I attempt to send it to an update to a user that doesn't exist, I'm going to get the same thing again. So that's exactly what we're looking for in this case. So what we're not doing here though is adding any validation into our DTO. When a user signs up, we're not actually asking for any of this information. So that means by its nature, all of this information is optional. So we're not going to worry about validation, and if a user decides to remove all of this information and just send up this on its own and to the correct user, then this would be a valid request. And what this effectively does is remove that additional information. And if I go back to the browser, then I'll find that the location detail is now gone from this particular user. But that's fine, because we're not asking for that information when a user signs up. So we shouldn't really make these required fields when the user can optionally come back in and update them later on. So this is all looking good. Now we just need to tie up the other part and make this functional inside our Angular application.